Yasher Koach, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. We're going to have a little Torah study based on the Haftorah today. And there is a handout, and I'm going to ask Mayan if he doesn't mind distributing to each of you a handout. There you go. Thank you. But while he is distributing, if you can open your Chumash to the Haftorah that we just read on page 222. Page 222. The word typology means, in its basic form, the doctrine or study of types or prefigurative symbols, especially in scriptural literature. That prefiguring means that you read a text not for what it says, but actually in the context of something else. So Christians often prefigure Jesus when they read our Hebrew scriptures. Jesus is nowhere mentioned. Jesus lived hundreds and hundreds of years, even after the end of the Torah and end of Nevi'im, end of most of the literature, right? Moses lived 1250 BCE. Jesus was born 33 BCE, distance of over 1,200 years. So there really is no Jesus literally, but Christians often read prefiguratively, typologically. Jewish readers of a certain era in the rabbinic times and later in medieval times also read typologically. As I mentioned before, they didn't read Jacob and Esau as people, but as symbols of Christianity, all of pagan Rome. And therefore, in reading about Thanksgiving, I want us to think, as we approach a time of interfaith relationships on Thanksgiving and the love of our American fellow citizens and our neighbors, to actually think about what the implications of the reading of Esau as being all Christians or all pagans or all non-Jews would do, and why we must not read that. So if you look at the end of verse 1 and verse 2, thus said Hashem God concerning Edom, I will make you least among nations, you shall be most despised. That is, according to Obadiah, all of Rome, every single Roman, not just the empire, or every single Christian, as it was later read, should be despised. If you look at verse 18 at the top of page 225, and no survivor shall be left of the house of Esau. That is, due to the circumstances of Rome's horrible behavior, and the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, came at great cruelty, it is understandable that the rabbis wanted to give vent to the feelings of the people against the horrible tyranny of Rome by saying, I hope nobody of that sort ever survives. And when Christians during the Crusades butchered Jewish communities, particularly in the Rhineland, the Schut communities, Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, were particularly devastated, and they were great strongholds. And that happened both in the first, second, and third Crusades, those communities, as well as other communities. It might be reasonable, or not reasonable, it might be understandable why a people that were oppressed and tortured and butchered and really treated horribly and cruelly might find way to give vent to those feelings. Here in America, where it has not been anti-Semitism free, but the official government has welcomed Jews in through Ellis Island and has given us freedom of religion, I'm wondering to what degree we should continue to be reading Edom as all non-Jews. Josh?
So I like to go and look at the whole context.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like, well, you could certainly read Edom as all non-Jews. Another reading is to go to verse 12. How could you gaze with glee on your brother that day, on his day of calamity? How could you gloat over the people of Judah on that day of ruth? How could you loudly jeer on its day of anguish? How could you enter the gate of my people? And from that, you could read that it is not all non-Jews. It is not all Romans. It is not all Christians. It's not all Muslims, what have you. It is those who do gaze with glee upon us, who get joy from our calamity. And those who stand with us are counted among us. Further on, but on Zion,
So I just want to respond to that, Josh. Thanks. So that's true, but this is about all of Edom. So it's assuming that everybody who was an Edomite gazed with glee on our calamities. So do we have a passage in this thing that says some Edomites actually did not do that?
I'm saying that they would not.
Or are you interpreting it that way? What?
I'm saying they would not be considered Edomites. And they become as though they had never been, but on Zion's mount a remnant shall survive. They're not all of them.
What verse is that?
Verse 17.
Uh-huh.
17 to 17.
Uh-huh.
Well, that's one way of reading it. Why can't there be others?
Great. So Josh's way is to interpret in a different way than the rabbis did, right? And probably out of context of Obadiah, who clearly is suggesting that there are Jacobs in the world and there are Edoms in the world. And Edoms means bad, Jacobs means good. Jewish means good, non-Jewish doesn't. There was a saying in the 1950s in this country, if you scratch a Christian, you'll see the blood of an anti-Semite. But I don't know, and there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the 50s. It was stoked by McCarthy, a demagogue, and there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the war. In fact, there were people who wanted us to get into the war, but on the side of Hitler and not on the side of the Allies. So much attention. There was a big rally pre-World War I, but in the 30s, 35, 36 at Madison Square Garden in favor of what the Nazis were doing. And in fact, if you look at high school yearbooks and other places where there were advertisements, you could see swastikas in many of the advertisements. It was very popular during the era of the late 20s and throughout the 30s. Only after we entered the war in 41 do you start on the side opposite the Nazis, do you start to see a diminishing of the celebration of swastikas in America. So we definitely have had a context of anti-Semitism and in a context where some Jews reacted by talking about Jews as anti-Semites, right? Just like today, there is anti-Semitism on college campuses, and there is definitely a cause for concern. But does that mean that everybody who's connected with colleges who's not Jewish is automatically an anti-Semite? That is what Josh is arguing for, that we should not read everybody as an anti-Semite, which is what I agree. I don't know that that's what Obadiah meant. Of course, we don't have any secret tapes or diary from him, so we don't know for sure. But I'd like us to look at a couple of passages of, while there may have been some rabbis who interpreted differently, I want to read some mainstream threads of Jewish texts from this. So if you look at our text, the first one is the Tanah Devei Eliyahu, which was formally edited and published around the 10th century, but contains a lot of the Jewish wisdom from the previous 8 or 9 centuries. And it states simply the heathen is your neighbor and your sibling. To wrong him or her is to sin. Yes, you can think what you want, but you cannot wrong a non-Jew according to this. I know that sometimes people in our days will make distinctions between heathens, idolaters, Gentiles, non-Jews, or Christians. But for the sake and easiness of this discussion, we'll assume that heathen means any non-Jew. There is no, and in fact, Christians and Muslims in Jewish tradition are considered on a much higher level than heathens. They are considered people of God and forms of the true forms of the worship of the one true God. So there is no stigma even of being a heathen or something like that in Judaism for Christians. But even a heathen, you cannot sin against or wrong them. Wronging them is a sin. Yes.
Certainly a wonderful quote, but if we are to take this at face value, and I think we should because it's a lovely value, then you could say that from the perspective of Ovadia, the Edomites did not do this for us.
Mm-hmm.
And so you could say that, wait a minute, we did not strike first, as we say. And to strike and to verbally smile when bad things happen are both bad, but I think there might still be a distinction.
That's true, but there is no distinction in the Tanakh Devei Eliyahu. It doesn't say the heathen is your neighbor and your sibling, but if they wrong you, you don't be nice to them, right? You don't build relationships by taking one act that you may not like and then ramping up the energy of negativity, right?
I agree.
Right.
I'm just saying that other people who disagree might say they started it.
Yeah, well, but that's true. But we're not going to be people of Ovadia, and we're not going to be like the rabbis who interpret. We're talking about how we want to interpret it. So in our synagogue, is there anybody who feels that we should interpret it to mean we should never treat a non-Jew well? There we go. So we're trying to see how we can build a world of peace and kindness and love. And I'm not going to try to justify the other side because there is a strong current going on today in Judaism where there is more isolationism away from having interrelationships with non-Jews. There are, and you go into religious bookstores, you'll see things like Torah Melech and other works that posit that non-Jews are actually not even, they do not have a Tselem Elohim. They are not actually human beings. Particularly Muslims are that way, and that we should treat them worse than animals because they don't even have the soul that animals have. And therefore, we can do whatever we want to Palestinians. We can do whatever we want to Muslims throughout the world. That in fact, if anything, killing wantonly is good. So I'm not interested in justifying that track whatsoever. I am not a descendant of Ovadia morally or ethically. And I am pointing out how mainstream Jewish tradition goes against that. I know they base those passages on the Zohar and on Tanya and other texts, but we are picking out stuff from a very popular and standard works like the Talmud. And the Jerusalem Talmud tells us in text 2 that where we have to collect funds, we can collect tzedakah from anyone, but we must support the poor of both Jews and Gentiles, support brides of both Jews and Gentiles, visit the sick of both Jews and Gentiles, bury the dead of Israelites as well as Gentiles, console mourners, whether they're Jewish or Gentile. That is to say, we should be the loving, caring mensches of the world. I don't know if it would be practical or advisable to even have one set of ethics that we treat Jews a certain way and a different set of ethics that we treat non-Jews. Esther?
I don't think it's advisable, but from the way that Black people have been treated in this country, it's definitely doable to treat. I don't think you should. I think it was a horrible thing in this country and a horrible thing in any country. But it's doable if you want to.
It is doable. Thank you. So that's correct, and it is definitely doable, and it has been done in many places. And even in the biblical times, there was slavery, for example, and later rabbis got rid of slavery because of its ethics. In fact, the first laws in the Bible, in the Holiness Code at Mount Sinai, are about slavery, because we who were slaves need to humanize slavery to the degree we can. We couldn't get rid of it at the time, but we did over time. So your point is very well taken. And I think that there's a tendency, if you start to put different sets of ethics for one group and a different group, it can lead to slavery.
Also, research has been done now that shows happiness in a society related so much to society, so much of wealth inequality. We should absolutely be doing generate society don't have wealth inequality. And I think a big step to that is not treating anyone particularly.
Beautiful. I love that. Yeah. So we're probably a bigger wealth gap today than we probably ever have in this country. I haven't really looked at the statistics, but we do know that wages for the average person haven't really risen, right, that much over the past 30 years or so relative to inflation. Whereas the CEOs and the corporate class, the billionaire class, right, their wages have risen 40 times, 50 times more, right? So your point is very well taken. It is easier for one class to look down on another class, but you are also correct that happiness is not a symptom of money. So thank you for pointing that out as well. Anybody else have a thought? So we're going to look at two more quick texts in the Tosefta of Baba Kama, just slightly less authoritative than the Mishnah. It says, stealing from a non-Jew is worse than stealing from a Jew because it entails Chilul Hashem, desecration of God's name or essence. What do you think, Baba Kama, what the Tosefta means by that? Why is stealing from a non-Jew worse than stealing from a Jew? Josh?
Because if you steal from another Jew in a Jewish community, other Jews are not going to say, this is how all Jews are. But if a Jew steals from a non-Jew, as we've seen far too often in history, even when we don't steal, the non-Jews say, see, this is how all Jews are. So you're not just, bringing shame upon yourself as the individual. But all of the people, Israel, and as God's chosen people, God himself.
Beautiful. So that's not beautiful thinking, but that is correct, right? So oftentimes with minorities, people who are in the majority see one bad act as being an example of the way all those people act. So if you have a bad encounter with one Martian, then all Martians are bad. Even though if you don't have that encounter, there's no reason to think, or even just having one encounter might mean that all Martians are basically good, and this one good Martian did one bad act, right? So if a Jew does something wrong, it may just be that one Jew who's basically good did a bad act. I think we've all done a bad act, and I think people in the majority have all done a bad act, but it doesn't mean we're bad or essentially bad. But there is that tendency to think that if you have a bad experience with someone who's a minority, to think of them as representing all, and as Josh points out, quite unfairly. Let's go to text number 4. Rabbi Meir used to teach, from where do we derive the concept that an idol worshiper who engages in acts of Torah is considered like the high priest? The text in Leviticus 18:5 states, which a person should do and live by them. The terms priests, Levites, and Israelites are not used. Rather, the term person is. Thus, we learn that even an idol worshiper who engages in acts of Torah is considered like the high priest. That is to say, sometimes when we look at people, we look at one bad act of a bad actor, and we don't look at the good acts that people do. If we look at the good acts that a Jew does, then you might say, oh, Jews are like a high priest. If we look at the good acts that a Christian does, or that an atheist does, or that that a Buddhist does or a Muslim does, then we should be able to say, oh, that person is better or at least equal to the high priest, the most important person in our community. And therefore, we need to treat them with dignity and respect. On the back side of your handout, we don't have time to look at it, but the conservative movement has a statement of principles from 1988. And in the section of relations with other faith, I excerpted part of that for us to think about how we in our day. This was done in 1988. It was just 23 years ago that it was published, but still, I think, very, very relevant. As we enter the season of Thanksgiving and Hanukkah and Christmas, that season has already been entered because of advertisements and businesses, right? We want to think about, do we want to live a Torah Chesed or a Torah Sinah? Do we want to live a Torah of kindness, or do we want to live out a Torah of hate? Mainstream Jewish tradition from rabbinic times through today says we are not going to be like Ovadia. We're going to consider our Torah a Torah Chesed, a Torah of love, a Torah of kindness. That is what we're going to promote in our community and among the world. That's what we want to show Jewishness to be. We don't want Judaism to be seen or the Jewish people become a source and inspiration for division, resentments, hate. We want love. That is our hope for this season of the year, when Jews and Christians and Muslims have more opportunities to band together for interfaith services, where there's more kindness in the workplace, where we can wish somebody a happy holidays with a smile, and to have them wish us a happy holidays with a smile. And even if somebody says to me, Merry Christmas, I take that as a loving sign that they care about me at this time of year. I have never once been upset that somebody said to me, Merry Christmas, that I had to yell and scream, Happy Holidays, I'm Jewish. How dare you say Merry Christmas and assume? People don't make assumptions because the majority is Christians. But I think that we want to put out a Torah of kindness and promote that and find ways to bring that out in each other so that we raise the level in our American culture of civility and respect and citizenship and move upwards from there to love. Shabbat Shalom. Happy Thanksgiving.